Thanks everybody for coming for the panel session this afternoon, or this morning still. So it shows how much time I have. So post-conflict state building, economic development, and foreign liberation movements in Africa. We have 4 presenters. I have strict instructions here about timing, so maximum of 15 minutes for each presentation. What we're going to try and do is have the presentation followed by a short 5-minute discussion after each one, and then hopefully at the end we should still have 10 or 15 minutes for a discussion of all the papers in a row. So if you could hold your questions, if you could ask the questions that are immediately relevant to the direct paper afterwards, that would be great. But more general questions, I think, on this topic, we should try and have a discussion at the end. So we're going to begin right away with our first presenter, Dr. Christopher Dyke from the University of Alberta will be presenting his talk. So I'll just kind of flag you if you go.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So my topic today is on the British-led peace building and state building process in Sierra Leone over the past 10 years. So everyone everyone knows where Sierra Leone is, of course. Within the Mano River sub-region in West Africa, you have Sierra Leone, which borders Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea on the north. Now, the past 10 years, the British have been very deeply involved in building state institutions in Sierra Leone. And much has been made of the British role in the military intervention, which ended the war decisively. But less attention has been focused on to what extent they've built peace in the country. And so today I'm going to give you my assessment of how they've done overall so far. After 10 years, it's important to look back on those 10 years and critique whether or not the foundations for sustainable peace have been established or not. Now, the UN also sees Sierra Leone and the peace-building process there as a success story, and I'm arguing that we need to rethink Sierra Leone as a success. Now, the UK adopted a lead state approach, which meant that the UN came in with a very strong UN peacekeeping presence of about 17,500 peacekeepers. And their role was to deal with primary security, so they essentially played that role, while the British could deal with more long-term institution building of state institutions, in particular the security sector, the police and the military. So the British priorities were that security sector reform, police and military were key priorities for the peace process, as well as mitigating corruption and poverty reduction. So you saw in Sierra Leone, the British were experimenting with a security development equation. So there was an attempt to link poverty reduction to security sector reform. So the security concept, the security sector reform concept, as I'm looking at it, is improving governance and democratic oversight of the security sector. Because Sierra Leone had experienced 4 successful coups in its past, the implication was that the British should prioritize military reform in particular, and the police to play an internal security role. So a bit of background, the Sierra Leone is a former British colony, and it wasn't since 1964 and 65 that you had a strong, entrenched presence of the British in the security sector and in the Sierra Leone political system. For example, you had British who had a British commander who commanded who led the military, and you had the police commissioner of Sierra Leone was a British citizen up until 1962-63. So basically 2 to 3 years after independence, there was the maintenance or the continuation of British presence in Sierra Leone. So, but in 1967, you saw a complete withdrawal of the British from the security apparatus in Sierra Leone. So the main point is that the foundational elements of the state were not established by the Brits before they left. And investments in social infrastructure like education was menial, and was not essentially, there wasn't a lot of planning that went forth to prepare Sierra Leone for stable governance in the post-independent period. So fast forward to 2001, when the Brits came back, they ended the war decisively through military intervention, and following up on that, the sharp end of the stick of the intervention was a 10-year commitment to build institutions, and the Brits found the Brits shaped the post-war period through various mechanisms. One, in terms of shaping the content, drafting peace accords and legislation to govern the security sector. They deployed advisors that were from DFID, and they would embed themselves in the security institutions to work alongside Sierra Leonean counterparts. 8 conditionalities where the intention was to influence behavior and create incentives to foster good governance. And in some cases, the British nationals took over, assumed executive authority over certain key institutions. For example, in the military, the International Military Assistance Training Team, which was a British-led initiative organized through the Commonwealth, was essentially de facto force commander, although not with that official title. He served as the military advisor to the government of Sierra Leone. But in this case, in practice, the IMAT commander was able to influence considerable most of the policies, and had quite a lot of influence in superseding Sierra Leonean authorities. So, just looking back in the last 10 years, I've been studying how the practices and policies were formulated and implemented. And one of the overarching critiques I have is that within the first 6 months after the war ended, the British and the Americans and the UN were very adamant about going to elections right away. There was a need to legitimize the state, and within 6 months, there was a lot of preparations to disarm, demobilize ex-combatants, and the main focus of the UN's exit strategy was to go to elections within 6 months' time. So there wasn't enough time to foster more broad-based participation in shaping how the peace could be built and the direction for the country in the post-war period. So this also linked up with the lack of local participation and ownership. In most cases, the policies that were devised were thought of in London, and the British had not even established an office in Freetown. So this excluded the opportunity to foster participation, broad-based participation, and promote national dialogue as to the best ways to build peace. The other problem is that Sierra Leone has become perpetually dependent on aid, which is a continuation of colonial practices as well. After the war, the government depended, about 60% of its budget came from foreign aid, and it was this practice ended up reconsolidating state authority without actually opening up the question about how to build a social contract, and it permitted elites to consolidate their own positions of power without including more broad-based development. And the youth, which make up at least 60% of the population, were completely excluded from engaging in peace-building debates. So we look at whether or not this transition to war to peace has been successful, and by all socioeconomic indicators, Sierra Leone there has been not even a marginal increase in terms of its development in these past 10 years. Sierra Leone continues to be on the lower margin of the UNDP, the Human Development Index. Income inequality is exacerbated, where you have a very small group of elites that control the political and economic system, and you have essentially no middle class, and basically just you have a great deal of the population that lives on 70 cents a day, which is roughly at a little over 70% of the population that lives on less than 70 cents a day. And about 26%, according to UK stats, live in extreme poverty, which means that they have the statistic is that they are food insecure and don't receive the sufficient amount, the minimal conditions for in terms of calorie intake. Okay, so the political conditions have also remained stagnant, and this leads to sort of what I call a permanent transition, where there hasn't been any change in terms of corrupt practices. And as I mentioned, the Brits did focus on this as being one of their key priorities, but they weren't able to use the aid conditionalities, and they weren't able to use those mechanisms that I outlined to gain enough leverage over politicians, political elite, the established elite in Freetown. So you have a concentration of power within the state. The state has become has its continuation of the winner takes all. It still has not kind of broadened the political system to include participation by civil society, which is which has not been a priority, and the resources of the government make it such that it's difficult to foster a sense of bottom-up participation or development. So this has led to an imbalance between the state and society, where you have a relatively strong state in comparison to the civil society, but no checks and balances from bottom up, and a limited amount of accountability by the foreign donors who are providing the bulk of the foreign assistance. So the peace building process, I argue, has been ineffective largely because of those reasons I indicated: lack of participation and ownership. There was very little efforts to integrate local perspectives into devising the strategies and policies, and even the benchmarks for measuring success were devised in London as opposed to in Freetown or in the interior of Sierra Leone. So there's a need to rethink peace building. The blueprints, the standard one-size-fits-all models do not work, and obviously the implication is that country-specific peace building strategies are required in this regard. This requires extensive knowledge and experience in understanding the local conditions, going beyond just working with a select group of elites. You need to be able to build broad-based, deliberative discussions and to build more democratic peace building. And this has led to a persistence of problems, and as I mentioned, the socioeconomic indicators, which were a source of conflict in the first place, still persist, and that threatens the sustainability of the peace. And it raises implications for the prioritization. What issues and challenges get prioritized? Because in interviews that I conducted in Sierra Leone for my field research, I found that the priorities of the Sierra Leoneans, while diverse, did want to focus on certain internal issues like unemployment, reintegration of ex-combatants, and dealing with corruption at state-level corruption. And these priorities didn't necessarily fall in line with what the Brits had in terms of their vision. So I'll cut it off here, and I'll look forward to questions and discussion.
Great, thanks very much. Perfect timing. So
central because it goes back to the critique that you developed later, in which you said the foundations of the state, even during were never laid by the British, right? And I think and that is really the basis also on which the British are intervening. It's like, okay, well, we didn't create a state in the first place. Let's go now and create a state. The problem with this, though, is that the foundations of the state, the colonial state, as the British wanted it to serve their interests, were created. So we are talking about two different kinds of states. The colonial state existed, and the institutions, if you read Mandani, for instance, in Citizen and Subject, it's a very specific state that was created, in which you have, of course, the bifurcated state structure. Yeah. And then after independence, the problem was, in most African societies, we tended to adopt the colonial state as if nothing existed, and then that created the problem, right? So by saying that, of course, then when the British go in, the problem is, they were like, oh, colonialism then becomes also the solution to the problem that they have created in the first place. So I wanted to hear your view about how international strategies for peace building themselves are implicated in these problems, because I don't think the issues of marginalization, those are all symptoms. I think the fundamental problem is the nature of the state. I would like to have
I'm just going to take 2 more questions, and then you can address all of the questions.
Mine kind of ties in with John Carter. I have to admit, I have not been in Sierra Leone since 1968, so this is more of a question than a commentary. But I was wondering, when they were trying peace building, how they could engage local institutions, local people to help maintain security, particularly. For example, Commodores in the Nindi areas, and there's no equivalent, unfortunately, on the north. But there'd be possibilities, I think, there, which they certainly didn't pay attention to. And the other impression I get is that the division, as you say, between an elite grabbing what it can for itself and ordinary people is that you're creating conditions once again for a pool of youth who could very happily join the RUF. So,
Sure. Yeah. One more question, and you can respond.
There's a lot of parallels from, like you were talking about Sierra Leone. I'm pretty new to this country, but a lot of parallels to Afghanistan and other places that peace building is happening. I think the goal of elites, engagement with elites from the government, like the Brits, who are, have objectives in this country, is to find elites that have broad-based support. Although that always seems like a problem to do, to actually find an elite who actually has broad-based support. In Sierra Leone, how are the elites chosen, and why did they not, have been able to deliver on what was hoped?
Okay, great. Well, I'll address the first question. The Brits were like insistent on, and they were supportive of this idea about reestablishing local power authority. So those that they had worked with in the past during colonialism, the local chief was one of the first institutions that was established in conjunction with a lot of other modern day state building aspects, like the Anti-Corruption Commission, the police, and so forth. But if you look at the sort of macro blueprint that was envisioned by the British and the Americans and the UN, was that it was reestablishing those state institutions, the central government, but also the extension of state authority, extending state authority to the provinces. And I would argue that reestablishing those institutions in their pre-existing form is problematic and needs to be reconsidered. In the sense that one of the reasons why many youth did decide to fight in the conflict was that it provided an opportunity for them to destabilize those power relations at the local level. And so it's very problematic that the overarching blueprint adopted the continuation of those pre-existing colonial structures. that did serve British interests primarily during the colonial period. The issue about the Commodores, they were a civil militia group that did, and they fought against the rebel forces. They emerged about halfway through the conflict, and they were essentially a pro-government militia force, because the military had completely disintegrated and was sided with a lot of the rebels as well. And so what I found interesting about the Commodores' role in the post-war period was that there's a whole bunch of issues that get raised about how they get reintegrated in society, but one of the issues that I looked at in my thesis was that the Commodores, as an organized, quote-unquote, quasi-military military unit, could have been an alternative model to the traditional state military system or paradigm. So you have this civil militia group that there was proposals by the Sierra Leoneans in particular, political elite that were Mende-based. For example, the deputy defense minister in the post-war period was Mende. He was the coordinator of the Commodores. So he insisted on retaining those units to serve as a territorial force. But the Nigerians were adamant that this model would not work because it would challenge the traditional state structures that the British were insisting on rebuilding. So in the end, that proposal of retaining these Commodores as an alternative security institution at the local level was scrapped. Finally, just briefly to the issue of the elites and how they're chosen, I can speak more to that issue at the military level, and it differs based on different state institutions. But within the military, there was a group of about 37 senior officers that remained, quote unquote, professional during the war. So they stayed loyal to at least to the regime and arguably to the state. So those were that was the basis from which to build a military. So they retained the British wanted to retain that core group, build a military from there, and start recruiting a new officer corps. But within that group, there were people that sided with what the British wanted to do, their policies. The ones that didn't, though, ended up getting discharged. So, and the British had an idea of basically their British strategy was to work with some of the junior officers, bring them up as the new officers, and that created that was a threat to the senior officers. So there was a lot of tensions there. But the British selected certain lieutenant colonels that could take over the military eventually, and it created quite a lot of tension. And essentially, the senior officers that did not fall in line with British policies were dismissed by an executive decision by IMAT, which was the British British-led British commander. So, yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
We don't have any bios for people, but Davey Rusalado will be speaking about the freedom of expression after the Rwanda.
Thank you very much. As you indicated, my name is Dana. I'm currently at the University of Ottawa as a PhD student. My presentation today is called Too Much of a Good Thing, Freedom of Expression in Post-Genocide Rwanda. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the literature on post-genocide Rwanda, but it is almost unanimously critical of the Kagame government. And so although I am looking at freedom of expression in post-genocide Rwanda, a topic that has been explored at great length within the political science literature, I'm not actually focusing my critiques on the way that the Kagame government has been sort of legislating freedom of expression. Rather, I'm choosing to focus my critiques on the way that we in the political science, primarily political science and social sciences literature, understand freedom of expression, and I'm using post-genocide Rwanda as an illustrative case to discuss that. So the outline of the presentation, first of all, we'll talk a little bit about the context. So basically the context so that you can understand where I'm coming from, where I'm coming from in doing this research. Talk a little bit about research design, and then basically the focus of my presentation is going to be on the legacies of genocide. I'm going to talk about the structural legacies, focusing on institutions, but I'm also going to talk about the psychological legacies. I'm going to conclude by discussing the implications and providing an example. I'm not sure how many of you actually read the abstracts that were provided to us. The example that's in my abstract is not the example that I'm going to discuss today. Rather, I'm going to focus my attention on the traditional gacaca courts in the context of transitional justice. I'm going to conclude with some conclusions and next steps. So the context, I should just say right off the bat, I'm technically a political theorist. So when I come into these questions, I'm coming from questions of what is it that how do we think about freedom of expression? How do we think about the regulation of speech within societies? And in terms of my research, both within political theory, within comparative politics, within political science and the social sciences more generally, I see that we generally have a number of assumptions about freedom of expression, which come to us from a very liberal theoretical tradition. One of those core assumptions is that freedom of expression is essential to post-conflict reconstruction and national reconciliation. The second related assumption is that the public expression of traumatic experiences leads to closure and healing. And these are two assumptions that when we look at the case of post-genocide Rwanda, when we look at the critiques that people are raising about the way that the Kagame government is legislating speech, these are the issues that people are really coming down on, and these are the issues that people are trying to advocate when they're critiquing the Kagame government. My question about this, being a traditional, typical political theorist, is, are the assumptions even valid? And I think what I discovered in the course of this research, which I initially pursued as part of my master's thesis project, was these assumptions may not actually be valid, and these assumptions aren't really substantiated in the empirical literature. So that's generally what my work is about. I like to put literatures in conversation with one another that don't really talk to each other. Political thought and comparative politics, political science and psychology. So these are the kind of conversations that I want to stimulate, and in that light, I'm not really trying to comment on what is or is not legitimate in post-genocide Rwanda. I'm trying to stimulate discussion, and I'm trying to stimulate critical thinking about something that we don't, in my opinion at least, think very critically about, living in a Western context where we really do place a lot of emphasis on civil liberties, particularly freedom of expression. So in that light, my research question is, how appropriate are current liberal understandings of freedom of expression to the regulation of speech in post-genocide Rwanda? And the method and the approach, as I mentioned, my work is interdisciplinary. In this project and in these literatures that I've been surveying, it's primarily political science, but a little bit in law, but it's also psychology. Because as I'll talk about later in the presentation, I think that the psychological literature has a lot to tell us about the way that expressing experiences of trauma influences cognitive processes. And I think that those cognitive processes also have a large role to play in processes of national reconciliation. So in terms of the method, this is primarily a literature review. As I mentioned, I did this within the context of my master's thesis. Unfortunately, I didn't have the resources to do a lot of deep field work. These are questions that I plan to explore as I pursue my dissertation project, and I'm definitely open to expanding on these concepts through fieldwork. So there are structural legacies of conflict. Rwanda emerged from a genocide in 1994 when 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered in a period of 100 days. These are the statistics about the Rwandan genocide that we all know. There are a lot of structural and institutional legacies of conflict, primarily in institutional weaknesses. And I'm focusing here on education and justice. And that is deliberate because I think that education and justice are the two institutions which really shape directly processes of reconciliation. Education, what children learn in schools, the curriculum, these are very important processes in changing attitudes about different ethnic groups and different identities. And justice, particularly in terms of transitional justice, these are the official mechanisms through which we come to terms with what happened and we attempt to move on as a society. So in terms of education in post-genocide Rwanda, there was a massive loss of physical and human capital. Not only were teachers deliberately targeted in the genocide as they were perceived to be members of the elite, there was also a lot of loss of school buildings. But more than that, I think that in post-genocide Rwanda, there was a lot of delay in sort of redesigning and relaunching the curriculum which was essentially left over from colonial times, which really reinforced and reified tense relationships between ethnic groups. The other thing in terms of institutional weaknesses in the education institution was the relationships between teachers and students. I mean, I think this, in terms of the political science literature, we sometimes forget to go down to the micro level. What are the relationships between teachers and students? These individuals are traumatized. These individuals may have very prejudiced views about members of another ethnic group. What happens when a teacher goes back to teach after a genocide and sees perhaps students which may have been traumatized, or sees students of another ethnic group? These are things that we need to sort of grapple with in understanding the institutional legacies of conflict on the education system. In terms of justice, again, there was a loss of physical and human capital. Lawyers and judges were often deliberately targeted. But more than that, the point that I really want to stress when I'm talking about justice in post-genocide Rwanda is the Kagame government's policy of ethnicity. Now, this is something that's really criticized in the political science literature. It's practically criticized unanimously, and I agree with those critiques. Basically, the Kagame government decided that after the genocide, there was no more Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. There was only one ethnicity, Rwandan. Unfortunately, the practice of this policy meant that there was really a sort of a monopolization of victimhood among Tutsis. Because the Kagame government is predominantly Tutsi-run, they essentially decided that Hutus were not victims of the genocide. Only Tutsi were victims of the genocide, and they've implemented this in their justice policies, and it really comes through in policies of transitional justice. So we have these policies of transitional justice, for example, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the traditional Gacaca courts, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and only Tutsis are allowed to claim status as victimhood. So what's really happening in post-genocide Rwanda is there's delayed reconciliation. It's very difficult for ethnic groups because although formally there is no ethnicity of Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa in Rwanda, basically all of the Kagame government's policies have done is push it underground. So we see that there's a lot, for example, when you read literature from individuals who've come back from the field, they see that, on the walls of bathrooms, there's just scrawled full of ethnic slurs or derogatory terms. So it shows that ethnicity in Rwanda is not a non-issue. It is a big issue, but the government is basically unwilling to deal with it. And that's primarily because, surprise, surprise, the Kagame government is an authoritarian regime. And more than an authoritarian regime, it's essentially victor's justice. Paul Kagame was the general who led the Rwandan Patriotic Army into and captured Kigali, ending the genocide. So basically, Paul Kagame has been in power since 1994. And basically what we're seeing happening is something that happens in a lot of post-conflict environments is we get democratic backsliding. Because we get a lot of governments basically saying, our situation is too fragile for democracy. We need to prioritize security over liberty. So we get basically, in the Rwandan case, there were massive defections of high-level officials who saw the authoritarian turn within the Kagame government. The Kagame government extended the transitional period beyond the terms of the peace agreement. There were rigged elections again and again and again, both presidential and parliamentary, and there are massive human rights violations, particularly of the right to free speech. And that's what I really want to talk about here. So basically what's happening is that the Kagame government is using narratives and tropes of national unity to essentially suppress the opposition, restrict human rights, but all doing it under the guise of, we're doing this for the good of the society. You can't criticize us, otherwise you're clearly advocating a return to genocidal violence. What I think is really often ignored in the literature that focuses on post-genocide Rwanda or on post-conflict transitions generally in political science is that there are a lot of psychological legacies as well. So according to some statistics, 55% of the pre-1994 population of Rwanda was directly affected by genocide. So that's a huge number of people directly affected. And what we see from these statistics and the tables that I'm showing here is that there was a massive exposure to traumatic events. So this table, first of all, is from a survey done by the United Nations Children's Fund of over 3,000 Rwandan children. And they found that over 95% of children had witnessed violence. So over 95% of children, in what they argued was a statistically significant sample, had actually been directly exposed to trauma. So if we go on and we look at actually exposure among Rwandan adults, we see that although children were predominantly affected in the genocide, over 75% of Rwandan adults were forced to flee their homes in the genocide. And And you can see that, when we go down, witnessed close family member die from illness, experienced physical injury, experienced sexual violence. These are all exceptionally traumatic events. And these are things that are very commonplace in the Rwandan genocide. So what happens when you have this exposure to trauma is obviously there are lasting psychological and cognitive effects. So in post-genocide Rwanda, according to the study done by Pham et al. In 2004, 25% of Rwandan adults were clinically diagnosed with PTSD. They met all of the symptom criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. 50% of Rwandan adults met one or more symptoms for post-traumatic stress disorder. And what's really interesting is that in the psychological literature, there's attempts to actually link psychological trauma with views on national reconciliation. So psychologists are actually trying to bridge the divide between micro and macro. And what they found is that individuals who meet the symptom criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder are actually much less likely to support national reconciliation, they're much less likely to believe in transitional justice initiatives, and they're much less likely to think that things like the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda are going to be successful. So you can see that when individuals are psychologically traumatized, it definitely has an effect on reconciliation. So what are the implications of this for the way that we study speech? Well, basically what I argued in my thesis was that speech is more dangerous in post-genocide Rwanda than in peaceful countries. For the combination of reasons that I basically just told you about. For the institutional and psychological legacies of conflict, these legacies make speech more dangerous. So, first of all, we can assume that in post-genocide Rwanda, there will be more frequent expressions of hate speech. If individuals have not reconciled between groups, if individuals are still traumatized psychologically, it seems logical to me to assume that they're going to be expressing hateful views, they're going to be using racial epithets, whether in public or in private, much more frequently than we might see in a peaceful society. So that's one thing. I think that it's also safe to assume that it's maybe more likely that the expression of these hateful epithets or this hate speech would be more likely to incite violence. This is a society where people are essentially primed, right? I mean, if we're in a peaceful society and you have the expression of hate speech, this is essentially the argument that the United States uses to justify the First Amendment. They say, we're a tolerant society. You can say whatever you want as long as you stop short of actually inciting direct violence, as long as you stop short of fighting words. We're a tolerant enough society that we think that we'll just sort ourselves out amongst each other, right? And I mean, we can have a sidebar conversation about whether or not that's a valid assumption, but I'm basically making the argument that when you have a society that's deeply traumatized and that has institutional legacies of violence and of delayed reconciliation, you're probably going to have speech that's more likely to incite violence. I also think that it's less likely that given the weakness of the judicial system, that people are going to rely on institutions to mediate conflict. And I also think that it's important to mention that it's difficult to objectively assess the legitimacy of legislation when you're looking at an authoritarian regime. It's very difficult for scholars to disaggregate their views about President Kagame generally with their views on legislation in Rwanda. So the example is of transitional justice, and this has been coming through fairly well throughout the presentation, is that most political science literature is critical of the Gacaca process, the Gacaca courts being the traditional transitional justice mechanism in Rwanda. Political scientists tend to critique it at a macro level, and they offer procedural critiques. It's rife with corruption, it's not leading to national reconciliation. What they're not questioning, and this is the take-home point of my presentation, they're not questioning the assumption that speech is fundamentally healing. And I think that's a huge problem, because in a 2010 survey done by a psychologist named Karen Brunias, a random survey of 1,200 Gacaca participants in 4 provinces revealed much higher rates of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, and really importantly, she found that these rates are not decreasing over time. So this is really challenging our assumption that speech is healing. So what are the conclusions? Let's go back to the preliminary assumptions. Freedom of expression is essential to post-conflict reconstruction and national reconciliation. Actually, I'm arguing that it's actually more frequent that we'll see hate speech, and it's more likely to spark conflict. This is the big one. The public expression of traumatic experiences leads to closure and healing. Empirical research coming out of psychology is suggesting that that's not the case. It's actually the case that testifying and expressing yourself publicly leads to higher rates of PTSD and depression. So what are the next steps? Basically, my take-home point of every presentation that I ever give is the need for interdisciplinary research. And I think that it's really essential that we start listening to the research that's coming out of psychology, and we need to think about the creation of spaces in which speech can heal. And I think psychologists will be very effective in doing that. And I also think that we need to listen to psychologists in the development of strategies for providing adequate long-term psychological care. So that was a bit rushed near the end, but I hope that you stayed with me, and I look forward to your questions.
Perfect timing again. So if you could take 3 really quick questions, please make them quick so we can get through the rest of the presentation.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the issue of using Western-defined psychiatric conditions like PTSD in a different geographic setting, and the move within the field of psychology towards defining psychiatric symptoms and disorders differently in different geographical and environmental situations.
This is a slightly different type of question. In light of what you said initially about Kagame and the critique about Kagame that's coming out, how do you relate your final conclusion to the positive developments that are taking place in Rwanda compared to the countries within the region, positive human welfare indicators, and so on and so forth in the region?
Yes, I was just wondering if you had the chance to do any field work in terms of semi-structured interview in Rwanda, and I think that's a very critical aspect of that, because I think the literature can say a lot about Kagame and Rwanda and everything is happening there, but I think it's also good to really have an assessment of the internal relationship between the Rwandan people and try to get the gist of what's happening there. And also I think the use of the term freedom of expression need to be looked at, because in that context, it's not always good to say everything you want to say. I mean, there's a limit to the freedom of expression, and I would like you to just comment on that.
And last quick one.
It's wonderful the way you're questioning the assumptions and going to other disciplines. I wonder whether you've thought of engaged with the whole issue of politics of memory and history, because it seems to me the thrust of much historical research, for instance in post-war Germany, was that inconvenient truths, perhaps understandably, are buried in the first post-war generation, and true healing has to come over time through expression of deeper understandings and almost national confession, etc. So I wonder whether you could talk a little bit to that.
Great questions. Thank you so much. Definitely going to be difficult to answer them adequately, I feel. In terms of your question about Western definitions of psychiatric disorders, I think that's an excellent point. I think that I'm relying on them because it's sort of the way that the psychology literature, and I mean, I have mea culpa, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a political theorist. So I feel like I'm wearing a lot of hats, and they all might be a little bit ill-fitting, or at least unflattering. But I think that you're onto something. I mean, I think that when I'm making the argument that we need to be more cognizant of context with regards to freedom of expression, absolutely. I think that we also need to be more cognizant of context and culture when we're talking about psychiatric disorders. I think that right now, the reason that I think they're effective is because they're a start. And obviously, any sort of quantitative tool to assess, how traumatized are you? I mean, it's rife with problems. But I do think that the existing tools and the existing tests that the psychological literature is using start to give us a good picture, or a good initial snapshot of what might be going on. And I think that there's definitely room for more research about how to make that more respectful, maybe, of local custom. In terms of the second question, in terms of positive development, human development in Rwanda and economic development in Rwanda, yes. I mean, I'm absolutely in agreement with you that Rwanda has made a lot of progress. I mean, there's a reason that although the academic literature has been quite critical of Kagame, he's essentially sort of a development darling, right? Development donors, development agencies are very quick to sort of applaud the progress that Rwanda has made in terms of development. I don't think necessarily that this kind of research and this kind of questioning is necessarily at odds with being cognizant of progress that's been made. I think that any government, particularly a government that's claiming so much legitimacy that Kagame is, should be able to sort of deal with critiques that approach different areas of governance. Obviously, because the Kagame regime is an authoritarian government, there's a lot of sort of tricky issues around that. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think that it is important to recognize the progress that Rwanda has made, but I also think it's important to question initiatives that Rwanda has pursued, like the Gacaca courts, which haven't necessarily led to the kind of reconciliation, A, that they were intended to, and B, that the Kagame government is claiming that they have. In terms of field research in Rwanda, unfortunately, no, I haven't been able to do any. As I mentioned, I began this research as part of my master's thesis, so I just didn't have the resources to go to the field. I'm only a first-year PhD student, so I have 5 more years, basically, to get myself over to Rwanda, something I definitely think is absolutely necessary. I mean, you're right, the literature can only tell us so much. For me, the literature is basically raising questions that I think is important to explore in the field. Also, I think that it's very interesting that you raise the question of using the term freedom of expression. I'm completely in agreement. The term freedom of expression is born of a very liberal tradition of political thinking, and it might be interesting to ask whether or not our conceptions of freedom of expression are applicable. I think the point that I'm trying to make in the presentation is that the way that we understand freedom of expression is not applicable, but I think you raise an excellent point of whether freedom of expression is even something that we can or should be looking at in societies that might not have that kind of sort of normative and legal development. In terms of the last question, the politics of memory and history, I think that that's definitely a literature that is very much at odds with my work. And it's a literature that I'm quite familiar with. I'm working at the University of Ottawa with Dominique Carleton, who is the chair of Ukrainian studies, working on politics of memory, and we often have these kind of conversations of, well, this is an experience that Germany had, there was a process of cleansing, of telling, of sort of, you know, the talking cure in Germany and other societies. I think what I would say is a way to maybe get to that place in Rwanda is to focus more on spaces. And it's something that I unfortunately had to gloss over in the conclusion, but I think that right now we focus too much on talking or staying silent. I think instead we should focus on spaces plural, of different environments where people can maybe choose to speak or choose to stay silent, or speak certain truths and stay silent on others. But I think it should be more individually led, because I think that there's a lot of almost collateral damage when we have policies of reconciliation that come from the top, and Rwanda is particularly problematic because the policies of reconciliation have essentially monopolized memory on behalf of the Tutsi and completely excluded Tutsi narratives and voices of victimization. So I hope that I answered your questions, and I thank you very much for your comments.
Rory Morrison from Carleton University.
Hi everyone. So my name's Rory Morrison, and I'm a master's candidate at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs here at Carleton. So my presentation's on interstate conflict and the importance of economic power sharing in comprehensive peace agreements. I guess the first thing I need to say is this is very much a working paper. I've just begun this investigation, and I'm kind of using this more as an opportunity to get feedback from some of you who might know a little bit more about contemporary, especially contemporary case studies. I don't have all the answers or any yet, so here that is. I also need to acknowledge that there are a number of dynamics regarding gender, grievance, corruption, colonial legacy, etc., that need to be considered when discussing the nature and causes of interstate conflict. However, in this presentation, I'm simply arguing that a consideration of wealth redistribution via economic power sharing and comprehensive peace agreements may offer the potential to enhance the sustainability of peace agreements and conflict resolution. So I'm not sure what everyone's level of familiarity is with the subject, so I'm going to go through some concepts really quickly and right off the bat. So first off, with interstate conflict, I refer to violent political disputes whose origins can be traced primarily to intrastate or domestic rather than interstate country-to-country factors. In these instances, armed violence takes place or threatens to take place primarily within the borders of a single state. When referring to power sharing, I mean that any set of arrangements that prevent one group or collective from monopolizing power, whether temporary or permanently. Ideally, such measures promote inclusiveness or at least the coexistence of divergent cultures within a state. In places deeply divided by national, ethnic, linguistic, or religious conflict, power sharing is a standard prescription for reconciling antagonistic groups, particularly where genocide, expulsion, or coerced assimilation threaten the lives and rights of minority peoples. Lastly, regarding comprehensive peace agreements, these agreements address the substance of underlying issues of a dispute. Their conclusion is often marked with a handshake signifying a historical moment that ends a long-standing conflict. Comprehensive peace agreements seek to find the common ground between interests and needs of the parties to the conflict and resolve the substantive issues in the dispute. So, my interest in the subject of peace agreements was initially sparked by three major observations, which I'm going to depict in graphs taken from the 2012 Human Security Report project. So the first is a graph of state-based conflicts by type from 1946 to 2009. And this is something that's been referenced a lot in post-conflict peace-building studies, and it's generally the observation that we see interstate rather than interstate, so domestic rather than external to the state conflicts is now the dominant form of organized violence threatening human security. The second observation here is that we find that roughly around the 70s for other terminations and around the 90s for negotiated settlements, we also the same time, intra rather than interstate conflicts became the dominant mode of world warfare, or warfare around the globe. The fight it out, or what I call decisive victory approach to conflict resolution, wherein peace was achieved when one side defeated another, was replaced by what are known now as negotiated settlements. This is a catch-all term for ceasefires, peace settlements, peace agreements, and comprehensive peace agreements. Thirdly, in the final graph, we see that although we now observe fewer interstate wars and fewer new interstate wars, we also see a uniquely high level or a high rise of conflict recurrence. So one thing the Human Security Report in 2012 kind of noted was that interstate wars are extremely uncommon now. We don't see a lot of new intrastate wars occurring, but we do see this really large kind of dispersion of renewed conflicts, post-conflict peace agreements turning back into conflict. So these graphs generally paint the picture that since the geography of conflict shifted from outside the state to inside, so too did the popular mode of conflict resolution shift from decisive victory to negotiation. And that this now predominant form of conflict resolution, reaching peace agreements through mediation, although apparently affecting the likelihood of new wars beginning, has also been marked by a significant increase in old conflicts resuming. As such, the question I have set out to investigate here and in my working paper is how to explain this rise in conflict recurrence by suggesting that there may be something to the observation that we have almost completely neglected the role of wealth, particularly regarding redistribution and economic power sharing in peace agreements. So what are we doing to address this trend of conflict recurrence? Well, as contemporary armed conflict has shifted away from traditional interstate forms, peace building has come to adopt more dynamic and micro-focused approaches than those of traditional peacekeeping. While once mainly comprised of international personnel monitoring ceasefires or placing themselves between belligerent armies, contemporary peace building is now synonymous with an array of varied strategies that attempt to improve the effectiveness of peace agreements in preventing conflict recurrence. A major approach, and the subject of this presentation, is power sharing. Power sharing mechanisms can be found in the majority of peace agreements today and seek to distribute calibrated amounts of representation and executive power to elites of all major ethnic and religious groups through institutionalized elite inclusion. Here it should be noted that power sharing as a mechanism for peace building has had mixed results at best, but does remain a dominant aspect of contemporary peace agreements. So looking at peace agreements today, I've done a little list here. So here we see a list, and I'll go through the entire list, of all negotiated settlements. This includes ceasefires, partial agreements, and comprehensive peace agreements signed since 1990. I've employed Uppsala University's Department of Peace and Conflict's Peace Agreement Dataset to arrange all peace agreements signed between at least two opposing warring parties in an armed conflict between 1990 and 2011. It has been color-coded to identify which peace agreements have had at least one power-sharing mechanism built into them. So just a quick look at the list here. So, yeah, well, you'll get the gist of it. So here, yellow represents local government mechanisms, which provide for arrangements for local self-government short of autonomy or the exercise of power through municipal arrangements. Blue represents integration into the state army and provides for the creation of a new national army or the integration of rebels into the existing army. Green represents integration in government and civil service and provides for the integration of rebels into the government. Red represents power sharing in government and includes provisions for extensive power sharing in newly formed government. And orange represents local power sharing and grants the disputed region in a conflict power sharing in a local government. So I've done this, I didn't slow down on the African examples because I've done it not only to give you a sense of the number of ways in which power sharing can exist in a peace agreement, but more importantly to demonstrate the preference peace building has placed on certain types of power sharing over others. As argued by Oxford University's Center for Research on Inequality, Human Security, and Ethnicity, and observable here, explicit commitments to economic redistribution are almost non-existent and are the least common form of power sharing compared to the more commonly addressed issues of sharing central powers, regional devolution, and military integration. So the red, yellow, blue, orange, these are all sharing executive powers, sharing regional jurisdiction powers. Almost none of them talk about sharing wealth and wealth redistribution. So turning to Africa, this lack of attention to economic power sharing is equally apparent. Since 1989, 116 peace agreements and ceasefires have involved one or more African party. Recall that, looking at those trends, these conflicts have been marked by failure and often conflict recurrence. Now consider this. Of the 116 agreements, only 4 were characterized by having any specific mention or chapter devoted to economic power sharing specifically. These were the Commodores signed 2001 partial agreement, Djibouti's government agreement signed in 2000, that was a full peace agreement, and kind of what looks to be one of my bigger case studies, the Sudanese government's comprehensive peace agreement signed in 2005. So it got a bit jumbled here, but those are them written down and mixed up. It's interesting to note these agreements were identified as containing an arrangement of self-government, which included control of a specific territory, the power of primary and secondary legislation, and the power of executive authority and power of fiscal matters. So even the mention of economic power sharing was almost a caveat to a larger discussion of sharing juridical and executive power sharing. Now note that all 4 of these African examples where economic power sharing was implicitly recognized have yet to terminate and therefore can be considered successful. So why? If the potential for failure of traditional peace agreements has been demonstrated, why have we not seen greater interest in exploring the utility of developing economic power sharing mechanisms? Here we find very little written on the issue. However, preliminary work by Francis Stewart and several others has argued 3 reasons why we do not see greater interest in economic power sharing. The first is that economic policy formulation is regarded as a largely technocratic subject, concerned predominantly with the standard goals and tools of stabilization and growth. Second, there is an assumption that political power sharing will automatically lead to a positive economic consequences and address group-based economic deprivation. And thirdly, that inequality among groups is frequently deep-rooted historically and requires a sustained policy effort that extends well beyond a single electoral cycle or donor funding horizon. So what does the dominant theory of the day say about the importance of economic consideration in economic studies? So I'm going to look here primarily and as quickly as I can at Collier, Fearn and Leighton's big papers. So to start with Collier, in his work on the economic theory of conflict, he argues that regardless of why an organization is fighting, it can fight only if it is financially viable during the conflict. This introduces Collier's central argument. That is the potential use of force to extort sufficient money or goods from their legitimate owners, in his words, the feasibility of predation, which predicts the likelihood of conflict. Collier unpacks his argument by identifying 3 key features that make predatory rebellion more financially viable: a reliance on primary commodity exportation, low income, and slow growth. It is argued that countries that have a substantial share of their income, GDP, generated by export of primary commodities are radically more at risk of conflict. In a separate study, Collier and Ank Hoffler found that a share of 26% GDP generated from the export of primary commodities in an otherwise ordinary country increased its baseline risk of conflict from 1 to 23%. As argued by Fearn and Leighton, these exports are especially vulnerable to looting and taxation because their production relies heavily on assets that are long-lasting and immobile. Furthermore, because these primary commodities are exported, it must be transported to a port. Along the transportation route, there are a number of choke points at which rebel groups can extract the tribute if they control them, even if only sporadically. Regarding low income, it is argued that people who are poor have little to lose from joining a rebel group, resulting in cheap recruitment for rebel organizations. Let's head here. This does not, however, explain why governments do not simply recruit these individuals instead. a simple explanation of how low income uniquely and indirectly benefits recruitment strategies over similar government strategies posits that almost universally, the share of income that accrues to the government as tax revenue rises with income. This means that the lower a country's GDP, the lower the tax revenue governments generate, thereby reducing the capacity of governments to spend on defense. I'm going to run through because I've only got a minute left. Fearon and Leighton talk more about insurgency and central government. What they focus specifically on is the government's policy and military capabilities and the reach of government institutions into rural areas. They argue that insurgents are better able to survive and prosper if the government and military they oppose are relatively weak, badly financed, organizationally inept, corrupt, and politically divided. So, concluding quickly, it becomes clear by looking at these two theories that although it is largely agreed that the economic wealth of non-government and government groups has a role to play in causing interstate conflict, little is said about whether redistribution or the economic power sharing of wealth has any effect on the likelihood of groups to fight. In what I believe to be the most advanced perspective on interstate conflict resolution and the importance of economic power sharing, John F. Macaulay wrote that strategies that create contestation for resources along identity group lines, absent provision for co-opting disenfranchised groups, increase the likelihood of communal violence, whereas plans that transcend groups bear the greatest chance of generating long-term peace irrespective of their short-term economic success. So taking Macaulay's logic of economic redistribution, when we apply it to peace agreements, and this is what I'm hoping to pursue, is kind of a threefold observation. One, that although redistribution by definition means that some groups will benefit at the cost borne by others, by making sure economic advantages cut across group identities rather than along them, redistributive policies better enable governments to cultivate peace. Two, that alternative strategies that target specific groups foster perceptions of group-level discrimination and provoke collective violent action. And three, by prioritizing participation, governments have in effect produced civic space and strength which gives voice to interest groups and reduces the appeal of the use of violence as a choice action. That's something I'm working with, but it was also initially proposed by Ms. Frances Stewart as well. So thank you so much. That's my presentation. Thanks.
So again, have a big question, and then we'll go to you.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. I guess I was just hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about your case studies, why you chose them, and what you're hoping to get out. Because if I understood you correctly, you chose them because they had economic power sharing and they did fail. I'm wondering if that sort of correlative point is sufficient to make more of a causal argument about that it's economic power sharing that's really leading to the success of
Sure.
these agreements.
All right, thank you.
I was wondering what you thought, what does economic power sharing mean in example, in cases that you've seen, and how does that differ from redistribution? I mean, like, you know, I'm thinking about cases like Nigeria where the central government damaged the program through their militant group in the Niger Delta. It's just sort of a trickle-down redistribution, but this doesn't really give them a stake in it. What examples have you seen where they're actually, like, these groups are actually brought in? And then you mentioned like programs that transcend the groups. It's funny because if you transcend the groups, then it's sort of, when you power share, you define who you power share to, and you sort of define groups. By transcending it, you sort of eliminate, you know what I mean? It's sort of like,
No, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, my question is about the second of the assumptions that you mentioned with regard to people who are actually generating these peace agreements, which is that power sharing in itself will create economic power sharing. And I'm wondering why that actually doesn't work because I mean, so in so many African countries, access to the state is the same as access to wealth. So if you give a group access to the state, how come they're not getting economic redistribution?
Absolutely. Great. I think I can maybe speak to that a little bit. So starting with the case studies, like I said, this is fairly new. The case studies I identified here, they're not necessarily the ones I'm studying. These are just the only 4 African peace agreements I found that specifically mentioned economic power sharing that hadn't terminated, or at least lasted 2 years before termination. Now, if I had to look at ones that I'd actually be able to use, Djibouti and Comoros, literally, it's a little kind of half a document translation. It's not really that important, well, or that valuable at least. But the South Sudanese and Sudanese peace agreement actually has a chapter called wealth sharing. So I want to delve into that a lot more. Regarding, and I mean, part of it I want to look at failures as well. So I think a large part of this project, if I move forward, might be looking at failed peace agreements and whether the lack of redistribution or lack of economic sharing of wealth was cited as one of the grievances aired by parties before they went or during they went to conflict. But case studies, this is something that I've really got to move into a little bit more. Thank you. Economic power sharing versus redistribution. I would look at the power sharing as being a more effective measure of involvement, where redistribution would be what Macaulay calls co-optation. So when you talk about having a stake for it, redistribution is just giving some money, passing it around. I look at power sharing as elite involvement. Now, the reason why I think, and I mean, finding examples of this is hard, but the reason why I would argue this would be more effective, or how it would look, Michael E. Brown talks about bad elites. I mean, he calls it bad elites or domestic elites, and how when a state begins to collapse financially, those elites, although possibly elected democratically or being supported by the majority of the population, when a state starts collapsing to retain power, will start to fall back on ethnic identity or religious identity. And if that economic power, I mean, when a weak state collapses, poverty sets in, you've got low GDP. When that happens and when that state fails and someone plays an ethnic card, you always see the economic wealth kind of following ethnic lines. So by power sharing with domestic elites that represent other groups, when economic turmoil sets in, it does place some of the perceivable, and then this is all an assumption, I would assume it presents or kind of places more of the reasons for why that happened on leaders of multiple groups who have now been given some onus over their economic well-being regionally. But this is highly theoretical. And actually how it would look, I've got it right here. So there was something written about a three-pronged approach of direct involvement, indirect involvement, and interactionary involvement. So this was setting quotas for, I mean, some of it's very like executive power sharing, where some of it's literally just setting quotas of ministers that are involved in the economy, and et cetera, et cetera. But there actually have been, and this has been a World Bank report by Oxford CAAS and UK Aid on a multitude of kind of ways in which it could happen. And I actually have the citation if you wanted it for later. Why doesn't trickle-down work? It's because of corruption. I mean, this would be one of my knee-jerk reactions, is that just because you're putting an elite who represented a group that used to be fighting you in a position of power, that doesn't mean that they're all of a sudden going to be responsible and give back to their community and whatnot, and corruption is obviously a fairly large concern. But again, with Michael E. Brown, in that peace agreement, these people are now accountable for the wealth that they're providing the people that used to fight for them. So they can be corrupt, but it's going to put whatever identity they're holding in a conflict at stake if they do the same thing that they were lambasting the power that they were fighting doing. So again, this is all more theory than case study, but thank you so much for the questions.
Someone under 60 come and set this up for me. It's here somewhere.
Oh, sorry. You just bottom right?
I presume so. It's not, it's over here. Here we are. That's it. Right. Okay. Thank you. I'd hoped that this was going to be a book launch, but unfortunately some disagreements between publishers meant that the book is just about to come out. I was promised that a first copy of the book would arrive and address in London before I left for the conference, and the advanced copy didn't arrive, but I was promised that leaflets would be at the conference. Unfortunately, the publishers don't seem to have arrived. So I'm hoping that what I have to say about from my conclusion will make some sort of a sense, but if you're hoping for easy answers and even a sense of coherence, I think you've come to the wrong session. Really what I try to do in the book, which is about liberation movements in power, is I'm doing a comparative review of the post-liberation record of ZANU-PF, SWAPO, and the ANC. And really it's trying to get to grips with the enormously complicated situation and the disappointing situation which I think has resulted from liberation over the last 20, 30 years, the last 2 or 3 decades. Also, I think I'm starting from, first of all, the sense of the enormous ambiguity of the post-liberation phrase. And I think the literature on liberation movements is increasingly moving away from the very triumphalist original literature on liberation movements to a much more, I think, nuanced understanding of what liberation movements were. They're very flawed and contradictory organizations, and I think the whole sense of ambiguity is what I'm trying to get at in my analysis. Liberation movements are undoubtedly movements for genuine liberation from racial oppression and very unjust existing capitalist systems. On the other hand, we also know that, for instance, the liberation movements were extremely authoritarian in exile and so on. There are other ambiguities which we need to look at, and so on. They promise freedom, they're extremely patriarchal, and I'm sure you're aware of those sorts of contradictions. I've also become increasingly sort of dissatisfied with the various ways of looking at the liberation movements, and in the book I identify 3 predominant ways of looking at liberation movements. First of all, the perspective of the liberation movements themselves as the liberation movements as representative of the people. And that is, to a certain extent, to some considerable extent, we might argue, true, but on the other hand, it tends to be exclusive and to deny the legitimacy of other forces which indeed contributed to the liberation of the different countries. The second approach, which I think has been very useful, but I think is limited, is the dominant party approach, suggesting that liberation movements have simply become dominant parties, which again, to some considerable extent, is true. The only problem is, I think, that much of the way in which dominant party theory has been used in Southern Africa has been rather static. It doesn't really engage with political economy, so it's very much a narrow political science approach. And secondly, I think particularly in the way it's been used in South Africa, it's tended to assume that dominant party theory, the model was the USSR, and has tended to assume that the ANC, for instance, was rather set up like the former Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and that leads to all sorts of, I think, problematic uses of that particular approach. Although I think the dominant party approach has been useful in some considerable part. The last approach is what I call the Fanon in Southern African approach, which tends to argue a revolution betrayed analysis, tending to assume that the parties have simply been captured by a post-colonial elite, which has become acting in a very sort of in the manner described by Fanon. But I think while, again, much of this is illuminating, and I use much of that analysis, at the same time, I think the fundamental flaw is, if you look at Fanon, he doesn't really engage with how do you engage with large-scale capital. And if you're looking at Southern Africa, you have to begin to think of how do liberation movements engage with large-scale capital. So I think while these different approaches are useful, I think they need to be supplemented. What I came up with was the notion of, well, essentially looking at the rise of the party state in Southern Africa, what I call the party state, and the way in which liberation movements have become transformed into what I term political machines. Ironically, one does go back to the political science literature for this. The particular useful model I found was Aristide Solberg, writing on West Africa way back in the 1960s. But I think it actually is rather useful because you can apply it to all sorts of different aspects, looking at particular the changing class forces, etc. What I'm going to do now is just to... Hello, where do I go now? Where do I go? There we are. Good. I'm going to give some general propositions from my conclusion. It's, I think, quite complicated, so it's going to be rather garbled, and I won't be able to deliver this in full. But the liberation movements inherited highly unequal settler colonial economies, which were relatively advanced capitalist formations. Attempts to radically reform such formations would inevitably encounter massive resistance from local and international capitalist and capitalist-aligned forces, while posing massive challenges of economic management and transformation. I think the fundamental issue here is that undoubtedly, again, ambiguity. If we look at the economies of Southern Africa, these were the most advanced capitalist economies on the country, and I think on the continent. And the liberation movements were coming into power wanting to take advantage of this advanced level of capitalist development, but at the same time not to get captured by it. At the same time, they realized in highly complicated situations that if struggles had continued, then these many of the advantages of advanced capitalist development would in fact have been destroyed. No one wants to inherit a ruined economy. So when we get to the moment of liberation, we have this rather odd combination of post-liberation democracy within a capitalist framework. Secondly, although the liberation movement succeeded to political settlements which embraced liberal democracy, the liberation movements espoused ideologies prioritizing the capture of state power as the means to transform societies structurally skewed by settler colonialism. Tension between the values of liberal democracy and transformation were inevitable. We are well aware that the new constitutions, in many ways quite similar, but for instance, if we look particularly at the South African constitution, an enormous amount of hype about it being one of the most advanced constitutional instruments in the world, etc., trying to balance all sorts of different interests, different ideologies, philosophies, etc., with notions of human rights at its center. But I think that if we look at the liberation movements in general, what we do find is some considerable tension between, on the one hand, their espousal of liberation as a promotion of individual human rights, and at the same time, the notion of liberation as freedom for oppressed groups. And I think we find, if we look at post-colonial, post-liberation history, we see this tension being played out perpetually in terms, particularly in terms of the notion of transformation, the need to perhaps subordinate individual rights to the need for transforming these post-colonial economies so that they are more distributive, more fairer, they recognize the social and economic needs of the formerly oppressed national groups. The fundamental to bringing about some form of transformation and a fairer society is the capture of state power. Because, of course, this had to be, first of all, the liberation movements had to capture state power, as it happened in terms of the transitional settlements, in terms of winning post-colonial elections, and from there they could intrude themselves increasingly over the years to capture the former state, the state machinery of the former settler state. On the other hand, of course, we know that the economies were overwhelmingly dominated by white capital, by multinational corporations, etc. And so there is always the need to balance these two forces and try to find some
useful way, one viable way of promoting mutual interest in highly difficult contested circumstances. And I think what we have at the end of this is that the notion of constitutional democracy, parliamentary democracy, remains in constant tension with the notion of liberation and transformation. Third, notwithstanding the liberation movement's capture of state power and their commitment to transformation, the transitional settlements combined with the global shift to neoliberalism to induce them to implement economic strategies which, whilst facilitative of economic growth, place severe limitations upon the ability of governments to overcome the structural inequalities of the past and planted the seeds for the subsequent social and political costs. Partly what I'm trying to understand is what I sadly feel is a downward spiral at the southern end of the continent. The sense that we're losing direction and that, in fact, things are going to get worse before they get better. If we live in South Africa, you are so often asked by outsiders, well, is South Africa going to become another Zimbabwe? I used to very robustly say, no, it's not. We've got a wonderful constitution, etc. There are plenty of other social forces. Now I'm beginning perhaps to raise some question marks. But if we look at the need, I've stressed the need for state power, the need for compromise with the different forces which were ranged against the state. And I think fundamentally was central to this notion is the need to come to some form of viable partnership with capital. I think one of the problems, for instance, with the Fanonist critique is that it assumes that capital could suddenly, in the post-colonial situation, be defeated, etc., etc. It doesn't want to go near this. It doesn't seem to want to get its theoretical hands dirty by thinking of how do you deal with capital when it's there. Doesn't it mean governments have to collaborate? Well, of course governments have to collaborate with international capital. So despite the tendency of the left not want to look at some of these difficult questions, I think we actually have to do so. But at the same time, this fits in with many of the interests of the party state, in particular the rise of post-nationalist elites, the development of black nationalist middle classes, if you like. But at the same time, of course, neoliberalism severely constrains options. The neoliberalism tends to encourage deindustrialization, failure to promote employment, which is desperately needed. It delegitimizes government intervention, and so on. So extremely narrow circumstances in which these governments have to operate. Then the question becomes to challenge perhaps the Thatcherite issue of, was there an alternative? And I think this is the major issue which the liberation movements have to tackle, and I think they certainly were alternatives. For instance, in South Africa, we are dominated by the fossil fuel and the nuclear lobbies, and certainly if we're looking at energy policies, we have to make significant changes in our way forward. I am not going to be able to finish. I'll just go through the last couple of propositions. As extension of liberation movements' control over the state machinery grew, and as party activities extended into the economy via the parastatals and party-aligned companies, approaching limits to growth were allied to an erosion of party commitments to constitutionalism and democracy. 5, the particular combinations of the party state and liberal economics against the inheritance of racially skewed inequalities and black marginalization has led to economic and political crisis, now greatly magnified by the crisis of international capitalist economy. And lastly, inherent in the slow death of the liberation movements as we know them are the struggles of a more democratic political economy waiting to be born.
provided it can surmount the dangers posed by the present global crisis of capitalism and its accompanying politics of extremism and division. I'm clearly not going to be able to finish my comments because I've run out of time. But I think that, just again some comments, I think the key issues we have to deal with is how do you grapple with international capital in these very difficult circumstances, and the need to avoid easy solutions which are not solutions at all. Many of my colleagues in South Africa talk now of the need for a solidarity economy, which is all sorts of wonderful utopian ideas based on social solidarity. Well, of course, one endorses that. But again, it refuses to look at this difficult issue of how you actually engage in a productive partnership with productive capital. Lastly, the last comment I'm going to make is that the party state comes up with the notion of the developmental state, arguing for state-led development. Again, that's a nice idea, but the problem with the way the party state is developed in southern Africa is it has very much become captured by post-colonial elites, and that it actually tends to undermine the way in which we know that developmental states, the successful developmental states, actually manage to go forward. So anyway, if I probably have been rather I may have left you somewhat depressed, but then I'm a rather depressed person myself, I'm afraid.
We're at the lunch break, it's starting now, but if we could just take, again, 3 questions at the end, and then further discussion can maybe be over lunch.
Thank you. I'm going to bring you back to where we might begin. Where it's better to start. When the Israelites left Egypt and were wandering in the desert, they turned to Moses. You've taken us away from Egypt where we had honey and everything we were eating, and now we are starving. So I seem to be hearing a heap of false lines followed, routes followed, that all the promises of ANC and the other National Liberation Movement had before, and they don't seem to have done any. That's fine. I know that we can heap, whether it's in a family or in a community, or we have heaps of accusations of what people haven't done. But whether it is Obama inheriting after 4 years of white rule in the United States, or it is in Nigeria where after so many decades we have Jonathan Goodluck, or Jonathan, whichever one comes first, or whether it is in different places. I won't give. I continue with the examples. Do we ask what did these people inherit, and how, at least where they have started well, so that we can then find a way of doing it better than just to see where they have failed? And that's my question.
Great, thanks very much.
Roger, I'm debating whether this is a question or a comment.
Sorry?
I'm debating whether this is a question or a comment, but I will proceed. It gets back to this question of, were there alternatives? What might the alternatives be? Not necessarily abstract alternatives, but fairly concrete, pragmatic alternatives. One of the dilemmas when we look at a lot of case studies of economic adjustment is that what capital says it wants isn't necessarily what it wants. And we see that happening fairly frequently, that business people will say, oh, well, the world will come to an end if we do X. But in fact, in countries that have done X, capital has been quite happy to invest and was actually motivated by other preoccupations. Were there more spaces within that framework to discuss alternatives within South Africa on the part of the I know South Africa mainly, I don't know the details on Namibia or Zimbabwe quite as well. Can you comment a little bit on that? Because it seemed like at times they were guided not just by the ideas of neoliberalism, which provide for some variation in policies, but actually quite much more concretely, as you mentioned, by specific political actors who lobbied very heavily in favor of certain other, certain particular policies. Is that the point of the dilemma, and is there a way around that that you've considered when we look at this question? So again, I'm not sure if it's a question or comment, but certainly something I'd like you to expand on.
Yeah, that's just following up on that. It's also the question of, can anyone transcend their condition of possibility?
Okay. I think the thrust of the first question is, shouldn't we go beyond simply condemnation of apparent failure? Yes, we should, but I think that particularly in Southern Africa, we also have to recognise the gains of liberation, and I think that is also part of the analysis. Certainly, South Africa, for all the failures, the limitations of present strategy, I mean, South Africa is in many ways a very different country from what it was 20 years ago. And there have certainly been some very important structural changes in terms of many people's lives, which the ANC has brought about. And obviously, the increase in social grants is the classic case. They don't lift people out of poverty, but they enable people to survive when otherwise they would have even less to live on than they do. So yes, certainly we need to go beyond critique. Even in the case of Zimbabwean land policy, for instance, we've got a whole slew of policies coming through, now looking at the way the land policy has worked and suggesting that, yes, these are providing some opportunity for emergent farmers and so on, etc., etc. So yes, we always need to reassess and go on. The last two questions really are based about alternatives, and I think that it's very easy. It's much more easy to criticise than actually to come up with alternatives, and that is something I agree. I think the problem is trying to work out what alternatives in the very narrow opportunities that are available, and yes, perhaps willingness to take a risk. The problem is that I don't see much debate or much serious analysis of what I would personally consider to be viable alternatives. In my own paper, I actually used the work of Richard Sambrook about talking about the possibilities of social democracy. Now, I know that makes me probably sound terribly old-fashioned, but the essence of social democracy, I think, is social inclusion, social cohesion, and a fairer, just economic system based upon a partnership with between state and private capital, with the state taking a very formative role. Whether you call it social democracy, whether you call it a solidarity economy or whatever, I think you've got to aim at some sort of making that some sort of partnership viable and working towards mutual interest. And then you raise the interest, well, how do you engage with the people who run the large companies? How do you actually engage with corporate capital to make it operate? And that is the big dilemma. I don't have an easy one to that, but I think that we need to actually engage with the question. In South Africa, for instance, I've just been in an issue about the National Development Plan, because now we're all meant to be bowing down before the National Development Plan, which the government has promoted. But I got into a little bit of fracas because I wrote in the press that the problem is you've got 400 pages on a website and the government has actually not been around the country explaining this. And who's going to read 400 pages on a website? and I don't think virtually nobody has read the National Development Plan. And then if you do read the National Development Plan, it's a bunch of different ideas thrown together. So I don't know what I'm not going to give you an easy answer. If it was a question, I can't give you an answer to it. If it was a comment, I don't know. Too bad. But I do think, just going back to the earlier comment I made, I think that fundamental is in South Africa in particular, is tackling the way in which the large corporations are clustering around still the old, its minerals export and its fossil fuels, and unless we tackle in some way the way in which those are being appropriated to elite interests, we're not going to get anywhere. Obviously, Zim with the diamonds, well, we all know what's to be done. The problem is the liberation movements actually don't want to actually think about how to deal with it, because they're in bed with the diamond smugglers and heaven knows what. And I think distressingly in South Africa, however much you argue about the weaknesses of the nuclear, I mean, the hugely problematic and costly issues around the nuclear option, the ANC has got material interests in nuclear energy through its party state companies. So how do you promote a green economy, which is one of the principal ways forward? We can actually promote employment. So we've got all these contradictions, but I think that if I was going to answer in one thing, I'd say tackle the fossil fuel lobby. Anyway, all I can do is